Good morning, everyone. My name is Lyle Morris. I'm a senior fellow for foreign policy and national security at the Center for China Analysis. I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning's Rapid Reactions panel on the Taiwan elections, the view from Europe, Taipei, and Washington. On Saturday, January 13th, Taiwanese voters went to the polls and elected a new president and 113 new members of the Legislative Yuan. Lai Ching-te of the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, was elected the next president of Taiwan, securing 40% of the vote, while Hou Youyi of the Kuomintang, or KMT, received 33.5% of the vote, and Ko Wen-je of the Taiwan People's Party receiving a stronger than expected 26% of the vote. The victory represents an unprecedented democratic milestone, the first time a political party in Taiwan has won a third straight presidential election. Voters returned the ruling DPP to power, a seeming endorsement of the party's current policy of pursuing more international autonomy on the world stage. In the Legislative Yuan, the DPP lost 10 seats, while the KMT gained 14 seats and the TPP gained 3. So the result is the DPP lost its majority in the legislature, and over the prior 8 years, the DPP's control of both the executive and the legislative branches of government gave the party greater ability to pass bills and effect meaningful change. So what do these results mean for Taiwan, China, the US, and Europe? To help us break all this down, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Simona Grano, Senior Fellow on Taiwan at the Center for China Analysis. She is also a senior lecturer and director of the Taiwan Studies Project at the University of Zurich, who is joining us today from Zurich. Also joining us is Wen-Ti Sung, a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, who is also currently joining us from Taipei. Also joining us is Rorry Daniels, managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute and senior fellow at the Center for China Analysis, who is joining us this morning from New York. And then finally, Philippe Le Corre, who is a senior fellow on foreign policy for the Center for China Analysis and senior advisor on geopolitics to Asia Society France. And Philippe is joining us today from France. So Simona, Wen-Ti, Rorry, and Philippe, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So just before we get started, one note to our online audience. If you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And I will try at the end to get to them and pose some questions to the panelists. So we've got a lot to discuss in an hour, so let's jump right in. I'm going to start with a question for all the panelists. And maybe Simona, I'll start with you on this. So the question is, you've all been following the run-up to the election and the results quite closely. So Simona, what are your initial impressions of the outcome, and did anything surprise you?
Right. Yes. Thank you very much. So, well, I was a bit surprised, just to dive right into the topic, about the margin of victory of the DPP, given the fact that we have all heard about, of course, voters' fatigue after 8 years, and the fact that the DPP has been unable to solve many of the most pressing concerns. And so I would read the elections like this. When it comes to China policy, voters have voted for the party that wants to put more distance between China and Taiwan, but they have punished and signaled their discontent towards the DPP by revoking, I would say, the DPP legislative majority. And finally, the other thing that surprised me a bit is China's so far in quote unquote mild reaction. We have seen, of course, Nauru switching diplomatic recognition, probably in retaliation after China pushed it to do so. But I think it is entirely possible that we'll see a more forceful reaction when Lai will actually hold his inaugural speech in May. And I'll leave it to that for the rest to comment on this.
Okay, great. Wen-Ti, why don't we go to you on the same question?
Right. So general impression, I think this is what I call a back to basics election, where all major political campaigns sort of rely on their base voters, and they turned out roughly what we expect the lower end of the normal vote share range to be. By that I mean that DPP's usual range is somewhere between 39.3 to 41.5. That's the usual range for okay but not great years. So this time they get a bit over 40, so that's roughly expected. Same goes for KMT. KMT used to get about 31% north of the vote when they were not doing so great around 2016. This time they get around the same ballpark with about 1/3 of the vote share. So really one thing that stands out then is the TPP, as Lyle kind of mentioned a bit earlier as well, that they overperform expectation by a couple of percentage points. What that shows me is that I think two of the main traditional political parties, DPP and KMT, at the moment are probably going through a little bit of a branding challenge phase, whereby the ruling party, DPP, for example, has been able to hold on to their traditional base loyalist voters, but otherwise find a struggle to appeal to as many swing voters as they may desire. And this goes to challenge the ruling party, whereby they try to be both their traditional more bottoms up, more party of the people image, that help and change party, if you will, and still balance it with the 8 years in power, experienced hands who can run everything. And that's a status quo party. So be both change and continue at the same time has been proven to be a challenge for the DPP, which is why I think their progress on winning swing voters this time around hasn't been as ideal as would be desirable for them. I'll leave it here for now.
Great, thank you. Rorry, what about you? What surprised you, if anything, about the results?
I think the biggest surprise for me was just how much support Ko Wen-Je received in the presidential ticket. I mean, I think that there was an understanding that the legislature would really break three ways that the DPP would probably enter with a minority government. But I'm more surprised that when Taiwan voters went to the polls and looked at the presidential ticket, they rejected both of the major parties and chose to vote for a third party instead, even knowing that the vote was mostly symbolic and that Ko was unlikely to actually win the election and govern. So following on, I think Wen-Ti's really beautiful and excellent analysis, I think this shows that there is a kind of a third anti-establishment force in Taiwan politics that's here to stay. It, rejects the idea of, winning elections through political partisanship and really focuses on the governance issues in Taiwan and how to resolve them. And you see that in the evolution of the Taiwan People's Party, which was traditionally aligned with the DPP when the DPP was out of power and was the opposition party, but has over time crept toward a deeper alliance with the KMT. It also highlights, what a missed opportunity it was for the opposition to unite on a ticket. And, unfortunately, their efforts to do that failed. The gulf between the KMT and the TPP on priorities and leadership were simply too great to overcome. But if they had been able to mount that ticket, they would have probably, contested this election very, very closely, if not won. So those are my major takeaways.
Thank you. And Philippe, last but not least, what do you think about the results, kind of like your overall takeaways from what you saw?
Thanks, Lyle. Well, a lot has been said already, but I would first point out to the disappointing result for Hou Yu-ih, and his speech was quite interesting, I thought, when he apologized to everyone, including the Taiwanese voters, of course, for having let them down. But he also thanked a number of people, including former President Ma Ying-jeou, who in fact may have done a disservice to him by giving that interview just days before the election, particularly when he said that, we have to negotiate with China because China is bigger than us and things like that. I don't think that helps particularly with the Taiwan electorate. So having said that, they have not performed badly with the legislative elections because the KMT is now the leading force in the legislative realm. which means they might be able to strike a partnership with the TPP and give a hard time to President Lai's government. And I understand there are talks about the future government and the new premier who might be appointed, in the next few months, obviously, between now and May. They might have to take into account all these results to be able to strike a majority for certain decisions that the government might want to take. The other thing I would say is I'm like Simona, I'm surprised with the relatively quiet reaction from Beijing. And generally, it's been a very smooth sort of delivery of the results on Sunday. The only sort of event that happened was perhaps the Nauru breaking diplomatic relations with Beijing. But as we know, these kind of things come and go. I mean, in the case of Nauru, I think it's the second time that it happens, that they shift from Taipei to Beijing. But generally, I mean, there's been, relative calm, and that speaks volumes for the really way of handling this election, which has been superb. I mean, on the part of the Taiwan authorities.
Fantastic. Thank you. You all touched on a little bit, but let me just dig in a little bit more onto the results, especially the legislative UN. So the KMT gained 14 members, the DPP lost 10, TPP gained 3. So it looks like the TPP lost its majority in the legislature. Which, I mean, what do you all think that means for policymaking? Of course, it's going to be more difficult to pass bills. I think the DPP has had the advantage of having a majority in the LY before, and then also on the subject of kind of the opinion polls of voters. Obviously, cross-straits was a big issue, but also it seems like housing really kind of prepped up to be one of the main issues that voters cared about, and stagnant wages. So, Wen-Ti, let me start with you. The legislative UN, the makeup, the power mix, if you will, and then the kind of what you saw from the voters' opinions on what issues mattered. What did you make of those two things?
Right. So in terms of issues that matter, I think this time around, because we have a three-way race rather than a two-way race, so I think there's room for more domestic issues to take greater center stage or more spotlight. When you have two-way race, like you often have in the past, usually election turn out to be almost de facto referendum on China policy. This time around, with a third party in the race, there's more room to discuss about domestic issues, things like housing prices, maybe less than ideal creation of new good jobs, especially for the younger generation, for example. And I think when you translate into vote share, you are looking at basically China policy still being the single most important issue, and that kind of defined the base votes for DPP and KMT, both of which stick to their traditional vote share range. And that also means, however, that there's room for other domestic issues, and all those domestic issues decide which way swing voters go to, and most of them tend to end up going with the new third party, TPP. So that's the makeup we see, and that's also what decided that eventually no single party can get majority in the legislative yuan. Implication of that naturally, I think, will be that with more players at the negotiation table for every major bill, it's going to increase the transactional cost for each round of political consensus building. And that may mean slow progress on legislation. That may also potentially mean occasional gridlock. And we know that all three parties generally don't get along. DPP and the new third party, TPP, haven't gotten along for a good 5 years or so. And with the collapse of the opposition unity ticket talk at the end of November last year, now KMT and TPP also do not get all that well as well. So that may mean more strategically opportunistic alignment behavior we are going to see in this three-party dominant legislature, and that's going to mean more uncertainty and just take more energy for agenda setting and consensus building. So not the most optimistic scenario into the efficiency of legislation going forward.
Simona, same question to you. What do you think about the new makeup of the LY and the voters, that the topics and the issues that seem to matter to voters?
Right. Well, first of all, let me make a statement. I think that, in these elections, of course, we saw a lot of more talks about cost of living issues and all that pertains to livelihood problems, because, of course, most mainstream parties before the KMT and now the DPP have been unable to solve them. But I think underlying this, we saw more of these cost of living issues being talked about. And they became more dominant because the candidates' platforms on foreign affairs actually all sort of like ironically aligned with what the bulk of the electorate in Taiwan wants to hear. So it is a stronger military, it's closer ties with the democratic world, and of course a commitment to the status quo that really avoids, on one side, provoking Beijing, but also seeks to detach, at least not officially, but detach a bit Taiwan from the orbit of Beijing's influence. I think that pushed also these other concerns to the fore. Now, we have already talked about, of course, what a divided legislature or hung parliament could mean for Taiwan going forward, for the ability of Lai Ching-te to really rule over the country without having a paralysis of the government. Let me just briefly touch, before I give the word to the next speaker, on what it could mean, for example, for national security issues, since these were really in the focus of the current also candidates' platforms, right? I mean, in this case, national defense, although all the three parties and all the three candidates actually agree on the need to continue to spend to upgrade the island's defense, there are differing opinions when it comes to, for example, which purchases exactly must be made, which weapons, and which amounts should be spent on what. And I think that a divided legislature, a hung parliament, will make any decision and related approvals, as we heard, more complicated. And this in turn could really hamper Taiwan's relationship with the United States, which of course would see Taiwan sort of challenged by a paralysis of its legislative process and a steady weakening of its military modernization, which of course is not what the United States wants to see, right? So I think, and I hope, of course, this won't happen, but it will be one area that we need to watch, the kind of decisions on defense budget and arms procurement, whether these become gridlocked or not.
That's really interesting. Rorry, same question to you. What are your thoughts on the new legislative UN and the issues that seem to matter to voters?
Well, I think the other two panelists have covered this quite extensively, but it seems to me that, cross-strait relations, as the other panelists said, were not necessarily the biggest determining factor of how people use their votes in this election. There is an opportunity, I think, for Taiwan's political parties to use the consensus on cross-strait relationships to build consensus on other issues. And I think that there is an opportunity for Taiwan's political parties to kind of meet in the middle on a number of issues. But it's equally likely that political partisanship in Taiwan will, as Wen-Ti and Simona noted, kind of stymie the ability of Taiwan's legislator to move forward important bills, or even to, kind of codify and ratify the types of agreements that the DPP executive branch would like to make. So we're in a period a bit of uncertainty as some of these relationships work themselves out. And I think that we'll be watching really carefully in the 2 years ahead to see how Taiwan manages a completely new political scenario. I think it's important to note here that there have been a few different kind of third party coming up in Taiwan politics over the last, decade or a little bit longer, but never has a third party kind of exercised the amount of power that Ko Wen-je's Taiwan People's Party is going to be able to exercise in the next 2 years. So we're in a completely new scenario for a relatively young democracy. And I'm, excited and watching to see how the parties deal with this.
Great, thank you. And before, a lot of questions on cross-straits issues that we'll move to next, but I want to hear, Philippe, any thoughts or comments from you on kind of when you dig into the results of the the legislative UN and the issues that matter to voters? Did anything stick out to you, or was noteworthy to you?
No, I mean, I think it's, my colleagues have already said a lot of things on this, but I think it's really interesting to see. I mean, I was in Taipei at the beginning of the Taiwanese democracy, so to speak. That speaks volume for my gray hair. But I remember, that what the legislative yuan was at the beginning, and it was, people were making jokes about it, but it has become much more mature. And I think, this new phase after this presidential election, which, as I said, went really well in terms of the process. Now, the result might not please the incumbent or the president-elect, but all these compromise that will have to be made between various political players, including these three different parties, heads of parties may have a new role to play. It's not going to be just the executive branch and the legislative branch. There'll be more parliamentary politics as it happened in parliamentary systems. Now, I know Taiwan is not a parliamentary democracy. It's actually, its constitution is partly based on the French constitution, interestingly, with a sort of strong executive and a strong legislative. So we'll see how it works in terms of, passing bills, and it's going to be a real challenge for the administration, which, as we've said before, is the third DPP administration, but the first with this president, and I think it's not going to be that easy.
Thank you. Before we move to cross-strait, I just want to touch briefly on this question of disinformation. I certainly noticed more discussion about concerns of disinformation, primarily from the PRC, but also from from the parties themselves against the other party about distorting views and even deep fakes, AI deep fakes. But now that the election's over, the DPP won the presidency. Wen-Ti, let me start with you. Did you see disinformation play an important role at all in the outcome? What did you see in kind of the run-up to the elections regarding disinformation, and kind of was all this concern overblown, or did you see evidence that potentially in the next election that we have to worry about, and just kind of what are your thoughts on that?
So, yeah, I mean, I think on the whole, obviously we're still waiting for more data to come in before we can do a more scientific grade analysis. But judging from what data we have so far, my preliminary assessment is that this information probably hasn't fundamentally changed the contour of the presidential election. However, it may have had some meaningful impact on the legislative makeup of the legislative yuan. By that, I mean that given that on the presidential vote share level, we're looking at back to basics. All parties perform roughly in line with their prior expectation and prior strength level. So I think on that part, while we do see a lot of rhetoric, a lot of conversation, for example, coming out of allegedly Beijing-friendly influencers, opinion leaders, and even YouTubers sometimes, about pushing this idea of U.S. skepticism. The idea is that maybe U.S. is less dependable a partner or friend of Taiwan's than DPP may portray U.S. as. And therefore, that argument works, then the natural reaction then is to say that maybe there's reason for Taiwan to recalibrate and hedge and maybe find other ways to accommodate or work with Beijing as another fail-safe measure, another backup option in terms of mitigating cross-strait tension, aside from just deterrence. That argument's been around. I'm not sure if it's a significant change to vote for president. However, there are some other related tactics, however, that may have worked for some battleground legislative districts. I've talked to some Taiwanese interlocutors, for example, who told me about a handful of seats in central Taiwan, whereby margin really close, and those are areas where folks at the grassroots level on the ground will be circulating rumors about how there are plans, lighting the administration, should the wind power will build the area into a major military installation, perhaps with U.S. presence, or even if even without U.S. military presence. The idea is that if they make it into a military installation or a base, then it's going to become a priority target of choice should any connected action happen between cross-strait. Some local people I've talked to apparently think that may have changed votes in the few areas where it was really close in those areas. So there's a possibility those might have shaped a handful of seats. And given that this is an election where majority legislature was decided by only a handful of seats, maybe that could have a meaningful impact in the longer term.
Fascinating. Let me open up to the group. Rorry, Simona, and Philippe. What do any of you three? Did you see any evidence of disinformation coming from Beijing and other countries, and what anything stuck out to you?
Well, if I can, I think that there are a couple of things that I would note on disinformation. One is that it seems as though, for better or worse, the disinformation was a little more muted in this election than in previous years. And I wonder if there is an experience, there's a bit of experience coming to play here. I think that in prior years, Beijing has been much more vocal in lots of ways about its preferred candidates, about pushing back against the kind of partisan party platforms that target cross-strait relations as a major choice in voters' minds. But looking at this election, seeing that the votes were in a three-way split, seeing that the opposition was picking up steam, seeing that the majority of voters were kind of deciding on the margins over local issues, there was probably a lot less need and a lot less impetus to incur backlash from disinformation than in years past. And I would note, Taiwan has done a really excellent job on digital literacy. And I think that this is a very underlooked and underappreciated trend. If you look back at what Taiwan has done over the last 10 years to kind of educate its population about disinformation, particularly online disinformation, even disinformation in closed-looped message systems like Line, where people are sharing false and erroneous articles. Taiwan's government has provided a lot of fact-checking. Independent groups in Taiwan that work on digital activism and digital literacy have also provided fact-checking. And Taiwan has done a really good job kind of educating its people about being skeptical about what you read. So in some ways, the idea that disinformation might have only played a role at the very margins of this election is also a testament to how hard Taiwan has worked, to tackle this issue. And I encourage everybody to look at Taiwan's digital minister, Audrey Tang, who's done a fantastic job kind of bringing this issue to the forefront, to look at the GovZero movement, which is particularly active in Taiwan, and to think about how those tools could be adapted for other democracies. We're going into a year where I think there are over 60 elections worldwide, including an important election here in the United States. And I think Taiwan has a lot to offer in terms of helping countries deal with disinformations and open digital democracies.
Simona and Philippe, do you guys have any thoughts or notice anything in this regarding disinformation?
Philippe, do you want to go first?
Well, no, I mean, I really agree with what Rorry said. I think it's, again, just to repeat myself, this election was very well handled, and I think on the mainland side as well, the fact the disinformation or the attempt to influence the result were somewhat subdued compared to previous elections is another example of making this election different from the others, and now we're going to see what's going to happen, of course, in the next few months. But and also, the Taiwanese electorate has become mature itself, more mature, and there are domestic issues and there are other things that come into play, not just the two-straight relationship.
Mm-hmm. Lyle, shall I say something very briefly?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about, disinformation and misinformation campaign. As all my colleagues have said, these are also very difficult to pinpoint. Of course, we know the narrative that's been trumped around, choosing the Kuomintang would, of course, tone down tension. But I think there also are some very visible attempts and some very tangible effects of interference by the fourth party in the race. And to a certain extent, one can say the CCP. I'm talking to the fact that initially there were 4 and then there were 3. I mean, the fact that, of course, initially Terry Gou wanted to run, maybe also due to other factors that he stepped down. But in my opinion, the launching of the tax investigation towards Foxconn had a huge role, right? And also, of course, his very small percentages. So there are different techniques that China uses. So let me just, conclude this by saying that I think this arm twisting that Beijing does towards Taiwan, whether it is militarily, economically, or with disinformation to sway the electorate, has, in my opinion, done one specific thing. It has really strengthened the island's desire to protect its de facto independence. And you really see, and this is the most, for me, interesting development, the two sort of strand of nationalism that were previously completely separate in Taiwan, a more ROC, of course, nationalism, and a Taiwanese one, actually coming together and becoming both increasingly more distinct from the mainland. And this is really, I think, what Beijing will have to reckon with in the future, because this is a trend that is here to stay, and that it also is of Beijing's own making to a certain extent.
That's really interesting. Okay, so we have a half an hour left. I want to spend the next maybe 20 minutes or so talking about cross-straits and then open up to some questions from the audience. So you all have touched on a little bit, but now that Beijing's, I guess you could say, least preferred candidate has been elected, obviously a lot to unfold, be in it to include his Lai Ching-te's inauguration speech, and we don't really know yet what his cross-straits policies will be, but we do know what he said on the campaign trail and his current vice presidency role, and what Tsai Ing-wen what policies she's had for cross-straits. So given his election, the DPP in power for the next 4 years, Rorry, maybe I can start with you on this. I mean, what is your take on what you think is going to happen with cross-straits? I mean, is it going to be, DPP plus some kind of twist from Lai Ching-te? Do you see any optimism that things could maybe shift in cross-straits, or are we kind of in for another 4 years of what we've seen in the past 8 years?
I think there's going to be quite a bit of continuity, but there are some kind of important trends that we should be watching. First of all, I think that it is important to note that Lai Ching-te has come out with a pretty sober assessment of how he wants to handle cross-strait relations. He said in his victory speech that he's responsible for peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, that he takes that responsibility very seriously, and that he will govern cross-strait relations based on the ROC Constitution, which is a one China constitution. It says there is only, one China, and the ROC is the representative of it. And he said that he would work very hard to maintain the status quo. So I think that is an important, reassuring, and stabilizing message for him to throw out at the very beginning of his kind of pre-inaugural path. And I think that there are equally reasons on Beijing's side, including, a stagnant and kind of struggling Chinese economy, the U.S. presidential election, not wanting to make Taiwan a focal point of the U.S. presidential primaries or elections this year. So I was less surprised by the muted response from Beijing that perhaps my fellow panelists. I think that Beijing has really boxed itself into a corner on cross-strait policy. It can't work with the DPP because of the DPP's independence plank and its party platform. And that means that it has relatively few options to manage the cross-strait relationship outside of political, military, and economic pressure. It chose perhaps the lightest of those options, inducing a relatively, small and developing country, Nauru, to switch recognition from Taipei to Beijing. It has not launched major military exercises, and I think it's taking a bit of a wait-and-see approach while some of these other issues play out. But over the long term, Beijing remains deeply distrustful and suspicious of Lai because of his past record of support for Taiwan independence. And between that and the DPP's independence plank and its party platform, there's really no opportunity or opening for cross-strait dialogue. In talking to colleagues from the mainland on the Taiwan issue, they think that Lai Ching-te is going to have to do even more than Tsai Ing-wen did in order to keep kind of the same level of tension in the cross-strait relationship, which was already not ideal, was already more than I think the U.S. and the international community would like to see. So the task in front of Lai is quite arduous. And my concern is that there will come a point, and I don't think it's in his inaugural speech, but sometime over the next couple of years, where Lai throws up his hands and says, there's nothing I can do to satisfy Beijing, and therefore I'm just going to govern the way I think is best. And at that point, his ability to kind of control, manage, work with the more pro-independence elements in his party, and Beijing's interpretation of what the party is doing on domestic governance, whether that's education policy or economic policy or other things, and whether or not that's leading to a sense of separate, permanent separation from Beijing, will become more important determining factors. And I think when we get to that point where everyone is subjectively interpreting what's going on the other side, that's when things get really rocky in cross-strait relations, both for both sides of the strait and for the international community, because you're suddenly dealing with issues of perception instead of facts on the ground. And people are using military, economic, and political pressure to change those facts on the ground. So short term, I am cautiously optimistic that we're going to make it through 2024 without a major crisis. But over the long term, I think some of these trends are deepening and worsening in ways that will affect cross-strait peace and stability.
Simona, Rorry, is optimistic short term, pessimistic more long term? What do you think about what it means for the next 4 years?
Well, I would agree with Rorry. I mean, we have a quite defined path, at least until the US elections, which would lead me also to think that things will be quite peaceful. I would stress that, of course, in Taiwan, I think all parties have a limited maneuvering space when it comes to their China policies, because I think that these are, of course, all of them mostly dependent, or aware at least, that they should be dependent on the US as the main security guarantor. So there's only so much they can do in regards to China and say. I think, however, that more than these elections, what will path or chart the way for the few months to come, and maybe possibly also for the few next years that are coming, is two structural factors. One of them is the China-US competition and how it will evolve. Now we have had a sort of a small rapprochement in San Francisco in mid-November, but of course that is not guaranteed. We know there's been already last week some frictions because of continued US arms sales to Taiwan, and that will continue to take place. And the second, I think, very important factor is really China's own internal domestic situation in terms of economic recession, but also military real capabilities. We heard a lot of course, of reports about how the military state really is of the PLA, right? So I think these two structural factors will have more of an impact on how the relationship between China and Taiwan evolves than the fact that Lai Ching-te, William Lai, has been elected, right? And as Rorry said, I mean, he has been very careful to sound not provocative. He has offered an olive branch to China. Probably will do the same when he has his inaugural speech, not de facto mentioning the 92 consensus, but acknowledging, maybe like Tsai Ing-wen did, that there was such a historical meeting, right? I still believe that, of course, China will refuse to talk to him. And so, as Rorry said, they have boxed themselves into a situation where it's very difficult for them to come out. But in general, I'll conclude by saying that I think that the desire that Xi Jinping and the party may or may not have going forward to maintain stable relationship with the US will be probably one of the main reasons why China will not take any extreme measures against Taiwan, at least not now in 2024, because of course they're also trying to keep waiting to see what will happen, whether Trump will be reelected or not. And that will have a whole different scenario of possibilities opening up in regards to especially US commitment towards the rest of the world.
Wen-Ti, let's turn to you. What do you think, based on what the two panels have just said, and kind of your reading the tea leaves for the next 4 years for cross-straits?
I mean, I agree with excellent remarks from both panelists. I think they're all very observant. And yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, I think obviously Beijing's preference during this campaign has been ABD, anything but DPP. And DPP nonetheless still survive and come back into power for unprecedented third term. So at this point, I think Beijing may be going through a period of rethinking and retooling in terms of how to go about managing Taiwan. Traditionally, Beijing sort of has three gears when it comes to managing Taiwan relations. They call it number one, placing hope in the Taiwanese government. Number two, placing hope in Taiwanese people. And number three, unilateral action, essentially. So when they feel there's a government they can work with in Taiwan, one that they like, then that's a lot easier. You see a lot more carrots rather than sticks. When the government is, for example, DPP, which Beijing doesn't like, then Beijing then places hope in Taiwanese people, hopefully through United Front tactics, hopefully through economic traction and other positive carrots. They may be able to change hearts and minds and then help again come back to elect a government that they may like better. That hasn't happened. So I think now it's down to gear three, which is unilateral action. And here I think it's Beijing that had to decide the two paths we have in front of them, which one they want to take. They can either take DPP re-election with a diminished margins at the presidential level and a diminished margins, indeed losing majority in the legislature, and conclude that although DPP comes back, its hold on power is more delicate than before the election. So maybe if Beijing just pushes it a little bit harder, it could have been enough to tip the balance over the next 2 to 4 year electoral season in Taiwan. In which case, if that's a conclusion, they're going to keep pushing, and we're going to see more instability and more pressure campaign come out of Beijing over the next 4 years. Alternatively, Beijing may conclude that, hey, DPP coming back for the third time, despite all our efforts to not see it happen. So maybe at some point, Beijing will conclude that maybe it's time to extend the olive branch towards Taiwan. And the fact that, if that's the mindset, and the fact that Lai Ching-te come from a more, should we say, Taiwanese national wing of the DPP. That's a reason that that's the reason that Beijing doesn't like Lai Ching-te, but that could also be a reason why Lai Ching-te can be a useful partner for Beijing, should Beijing ever wish to extend some kind of olive branch to DPP government over the next 4 years. And here I'm plugging into the equation this only Nixon, the Cold Warrior, can go to Beijing concept. By the same token, should Beijing ever be willing to extend some kind of flexibility when it comes to condition for talk with Taiwan, then Lai Ching-te being trusted by the national swing of the DPP may actually be a stronger negotiation partner as far as working with Beijing without suffering nearly as much domestic blowback. The kind of blowback that perhaps the less Taiwanese nationalist leader of Taiwan would suffer, as we know from past experience. So I'll leave it there.
Philippe, same question to you, and also broaden it a little bit. You wrote a paper recently for Center for China Analysis on Europe's views of Taiwan and cross-straits issues. And what do you make of the next 4 years for cross-straits tension, and also to the extent that you'd like to speak to it, what do you think it means for Europe as far as this, the security aspect of DPP in power for the next 4 years in cross-straits?
I would say generally, it's not going to be easy for Mr. Lai to succeed President Tsai, who was underrated at the beginning, but who actually did really well in preserving the status quo. We don't know what his policy will be, although we had hints during the campaign, but it's going to be tough. First dealing with the mainland, but also and the Nauru case is a good example of what China could do to his administration and to the DPP administration. I also wanted, before I turn to your question, Lai, I wanted to say that we spoke about disinformation and Chinese influence and these kind of things. Again, the legislative yuan and the fact there will be some kind of cohabitation between two different parties in power, or at least there'll be maybe a coalition or ad hoc coalitions, might be a way for Beijing to influence things directly or indirectly that may lead China or pro-China elements to actually play a role in Taiwan. Now, that's not my hope, but that's a possibility. Turning to your question, I think a lot, will of course depend on the U.S.-China relationship. People are already speculating or where the next crisis will come between the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. Let's hope for that none of them take place, but certainly the Taiwan Strait, because of the upcoming U.S. presidential election and the China issue being one of the most critical foreign policy issues, may sit on the side for a while. And as far as Europe is concerned, I think, this campaign and generally a fairly astute public diplomacy from Taiwan and foreign policy from Taiwan, especially on the part of the current foreign minister, we'll see whether he remains in office, Joseph Wu, has made the Taiwan topic more visible in places like Europe, and also the military situation, the exercises that took place in the summer of 2022 in particular, have made Europeans and many countries around the world more concerned about the Taiwan, the security situation in Taiwan, and more concerned that there is this a small but vibrant democracy in East Asia that's just elected a president for the fifth or sixth time. I can't remember, but I was there for the first election in 1996, so I do remember that one. With Li Tenghui when he was first democratically elected. Now, at the time, people didn't really care, but now, of course, they care because the threat has become more obvious. And Taiwan has been able to explain this to all kinds of audiences through the media, through their diplomats, and through the very cautious diplomatic style of President Tsai Ing-wen and her officials, including the digital minister, I agree, who's been playing a very interesting role in broadcasting Taiwan's ideas and on digital issues as well as on gender issues, just as a side comment.
Great, thank you, Philippe. All right, we have about 12 minutes left. Let me turn to the online audience questions. We have a few related to, we have one on a questioner asks about the U.S. elections and what role, what would change based on who wins. And we don't have to get into the specifics of kind of that type of speculation, but just on Rory's point about the U.S. elections as a factor in cross-strait relations. If anyone wants to chime in on that, in particular, what the U.S. election would mean for cross-straits would be great. And then one other question, actually two other questions related to kind of the specific roles of policymakers in Taiwan. One user asks about the Speaker of the Parliament in the Legislative Yuan in Taiwan, and whoever that person is, what results, what role would that person play, and what scenarios do you see for who that person might be, Speaker of the Parliament in Taiwan? And then also a question on Xiao Bi Kim, the Vice President, the Vice President who used to be the representative to the U.S. What is her role in cross-straits, if any? Will she have an effect because of her previous background on cross-straits issues? Will her experience be helpful to lie for cross-straits issues? So kind of three somewhat different divergent questions, but I'll open it up to anyone who has a thought or an idea from those three questions.
Well, I could take the one on the U.S. elections, of course, and maybe Xiao Kim and her effect. So I think that, let me start with Vice President-elect Xiao. I think that, in lots of ways, her Lai Ching-te's choice of her as a vice presidential candidate really was because of her strong relationships inside the U.S. I think that was an area where Lai was seen as a little bit deficient, for lack of a better word. And Xiao Kim really gave him the credentials of being able to manage and strengthen the U.S.-Taiwan unofficial relationship. So she's already had an effect, I think, an effect on his victory and an effect on cross-strait policy. And I expect that she'll continue to play a really important role in that U.S.-Taiwan unofficial relationship moving forward. I think that when it comes to the U.S. presidential election, it's very difficult to make predictions. You can, at this point, we don't actually know who the candidates are for the U.S. presidential election. But I think we are going to see, among the parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, two different worldviews of how U.S. power should be amassed and used in the world. And that will have an effect on U.S.-China relations. I think that, Beijing's real nightmare scenario is not necessarily Lai Ching-te winning the presidency of Taiwan, but it's the combination of Lai Ching-te and perhaps Donald Trump coming back into the White House in the United States. I think Beijing sees both Lai and Trump as unpredictable and hostile, frankly, to Beijing's use of power in the world. And so it worries about an unstable relationship with the U.S. at the same time that it's trying to, in its mind, deter Taiwan independence activists. And of course, people who had been in Trump's orbit or administration before, including former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who might receive a big job in a future Republican administration, whether it's Trump or another candidate. He has gone to Taiwan and said that, the U.S. should recognize Taiwan as an independent country because those are the facts. So I think that there is real reason for Beijing to be concerned about the effects of the U.S. election on cross-strait peace and stability. But it's hard to it's hard to be predictive about the situation because it is impossible, I think, to predict a Trump administration's moves. And it's very difficult at this point to know, how this election will shape up, what narratives will be used, and what that means for U.S. policy going forward. But Taiwan's starting from a good point, having Xiao Kim in the executive UN, being very close to the president, and having those strong relationships in the U.S. to manage whatever road is ahead.
Thank you, Rorry. Anyone else on the Speaker of the Parliament or Xiao Kim or the other questions that were posed?
I could probably add a few things that are not necessarily, I agree with what Rorry said, but I think to a certain extent for Beijing, if Trump is as erratic and behaves in the same way that he did in the first administration, sorry, I shouldn't have said that, but yeah, I think it could also play into Beijing's hands to a certain extent because it would sort of leave and pave the way for less American influence onto the outside world, less transatlantic unity with Europe, more inward-looking administration, and this could also give a chance to China to cement its position in the global South. But of course, it's as Rorry said, we don't really know exactly how that will pan out. And just very briefly for the president of the Legislative Yuan, it's a very important, I think maybe Wen-Ti can also say something to that. He's more knowledgeable than me, but I think as far as I remember, especially when Ma Ying-jeou was ruling and Wang Jinping was covering this role, it's a very important figure, of course, because he presides over the UN sittings, of course, and is responsible for administrating the Legislative Yuan, and especially in a case like the one we have now, where we have three parties, none of them really has an overwhelming majority that allows it to rule on its own, or rather to pass budgets and and laws with a majority. I think this figure should be a compromise figure. And so from the kind of things we've heard, Han Kuo-yu, for example, would be a very bad choice as a compromise figure for part of the electorate. So it's going to be tricky who gets elected and how these three parties actually agree on this important figure.
Okay, maybe I'll add, since someone mentioned my name as well. The legislative speaker part, definitely head of the legislature, the speaker role plays a significant role in terms of legislative agenda, in terms of which bills get debated, and the rough timing in terms of when those get more further discussion, potentially get voted on. So certainly a big role, and we saw that in second term Ma Ying-jeou, especially when Wang Jinping was a major figure in the Senate KMT. One other thing I'll mention about legislative speaker is that oftentimes for major legislation that were unofficially put into the too hard basket, when inter-party consensus is difficult or horse trading proved too complicated, at least in public, rather than getting put through to a vote on the floor, oftentimes they enter into what they called 政党协商, which is inter-party negotiation process. By that, it means they don't go to the floor for a vote. Rather, the head figures of each party's caucus get into a closed room to work it out. And should they not work it out, then those bills essentially get indefinitely rescheduled until further notice. So it's why a head or speaker of the legislature is a very highly important job, one that requires a lot of skill set for depth diplomacy to make it work. And so certainly important influential position. As to likely candidate at the moment, I think we're looking at Han Kuo-yu is number one on the party list legislator ticket for the biggest party now in the legislature, KMT. So I think he's one of the front-running candidates. People also talk about Yeo Si-kwon for the ruling party DPP, who has been speaker for 4 years. And then for the TPP, there's various rumors, but people like Huang Shanshan, who has been Ko-Wen-je's campaign manager for a long time, also on the ticket, so as potentially Huang Guochang, for example, who used to be head of the fourth largest party, at one point head of the third largest party, who recently has joined TPP. So I think these are some of the figures to watch.
Philippe, last word to you if you want it, and anything you want to add to what's been discussed or the questions?
Sure, I'll just answer to our friend Gerrit's question on the chat, who was asking me about Europe's reactions and the fact the Czech Republic, the president of the Czech Republic had already congratulated President-elect Lai. Well, of course, there are differences depending who you talk to in Europe. I mean, there are 27 countries, but certainly the Baltic states, especially one thinks of Lithuania, which has opened a Taiwan office in Vilnius. One thinks of the Czech Republic, which has a very pro-Taiwan policy, even though it never broke diplomatic relations with Beijing, nor did Beijing broke diplomatic relations. But at the same time, the EU will remain very cautious, and Germany and France particularly wants to preserve their relations with Beijing. So I'll just say that, that the EU is split, but again, the mood has been shifting, and that would be my main message.
Great. Thank you so much. Much more to discuss and debate as you all raised. We're just starting out on this new kind of journey of under Lai. So thank you all for joining. Thank you all for the online audience for participating. Look forward to seeing you all for the next event.